The RTX 4070 Ti has been out for a little over 2 months now, and since its launch, it didn't exactly get greeted with the best reception due to the price to performance proposition that it offered. And with custom AIB cards generally commanding an even higher price, what does that mean for consumers wanting the latest GPU from Nvidia without spending over the odds? Well, that's where the Inno3D iCHILL X3 comes into play. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So let's start by telling you what you get for around $120 or £120 more over an MSRP based card. Now, as the name suggests, you get a triple fan cooler, 60 MHz overclock, and a bump in power from the stock 285 watts, now up to 320 watts. So I'm expecting some good things when it comes to a small amount of extra performance, some strong overclocking headroom, and of course, as Inno have shown us on other models, level of performance in terms of cooling and noise that could warrant the extra pricing, depending on the user. Now, I won't lie and say that various AIB cards offer huge leaps and bounds over each other, as that's not the case, and instead is typically dictated by what's available to buy when you have the cash available. Though it's still worth making sure that the cards we look at don't perform like a lemon, so that you can make a well-informed decision when you're actually ready to buy. Now, the design is very typical of what we've seen from Inno3D on the 4080 and 4090 base cards, and has kept a similar style for the 4070 Ti, and comes in quite large too, at 334mm long, 148mm high, and 62mm thick, meaning that while it does take up 2 physical expansion slots in your case, the cooler shroud sticks out a little further than that. It's also the heaviest 4070 Ti that we've had in our offices, coming in at 1900 grams, which when compared to the Gigabyte Gaming OC, which weighed 1740 grams, and the Asus TUF at 1500 grams, is quite a stark difference, but also reflected in how solid the card feels too. Now, due to its length and weight, Inno have included a stand to help prop the card up, which, while it's not a bracket that screws in like we've seen on other 4070 Ti's, it does the job well and helps to eliminate sag. The shroud, as mentioned, is very typical of what we've come to expect from the flagship range from Inno3D, with black plastic and kind of gunmetal accents that can actually be removed if wanted, though I'm not sure why you'd want to. Maybe so you could 3D print other colours, who knows. Now, for the triple fan setup, Inno have gone quite big at 98mm each, and in typical fashion, the 2 outer fans spin anti-clockwise to help reduce turbulence as they ramp up. There's some simple iCHILL branding here, but everything looks very stealthy overall. Along the top is the first sign of kind of colour with a splash of RGB that lights up when the card's turned on, and if wanting to control it, it can be connected to your motherboard with the included cable and tweaked within your motherboard software. Sadly, even though this is a flagship, there's no BIOS switch, which, I don't know, is an odd move and something that has been missed off other 40 series cards from Inno3D that we've looked at in the past. Hopefully this is something that they can take on board, and who knows, we may see it implemented in the future, as I can't see it actually being that difficult to include. Now, also along the top is the 12VH PWR connector, but I do have a bit of a gripe with it, as it's very deeply inset due to the backplate and cooler sitting much higher than the PCB. Now, while this won't be an issue with, let's say, 99% of the general public, for us tech media and reviewers, it's a bit of a nightmare, as we're constantly connecting and disconnecting hardware. And in all honesty, it hurts my hands.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
The other small gripe, but I can overlook, is that the card comes with a triple 8-pin to 12VH PWR adapter, though even at 320 watts as a total board power, that's a little bit overkill, and a dual 8-pin adapter would have sufficed. Though in Inno3D's defense, they likely have tons of these adapters sitting around, so it's easier to just have triples to supply for most cards and adding another adapter cable into the mix. Now, what that heightened power limit means is that the card comes with a boost speed of 2670 MHz, which is 60 MHz faster than a reference 4070 Ti, which may lead to more performance, but there's kind of more variables at play than just power, which we will get into shortly. The other area that's worth touching on is the backplate, which is very large. In fact, it's double the length of the PCB. Firstly, to add in stability, but also with plenty of cutouts, should assist in airflow and temperatures too. Now, there's nothing out of the ordinary when looking at the I/O, which features triple DisplayPort connectors and a single HDMI, along with ventilation cutouts that match the styling on the backplate. Taking the card apart was very easy and consists of 8 screws to remove the backplate, along with the 4 screws that hold the cooler onto the PCB, making contact with the GPU core. The I/O also has 3 small screws if wanting to remove that, and then if wanting to take the shroud and heatsink apart, there's a further 3 screws on the outside of the shroud and 3 on the inside of the cooler, making it easy to fully strip down and clean. The PCB actually did shock me a little bit, as it is very, very small and is very reminiscent of the Nvidia FE PCB with a kind of V-shaped cutout. It's extremely compact, but it doesn't feel like any corners have been cut. There's some connectors in the bottom right of the board for the triple fan and plenty of space for more memory modules, so maybe we could see a higher memory capacity card at a later date. While that's unlikely, it's not completely out of the question. Now, in terms of power delivery, the card features an 11-phase setup for the GPU and a further 2 phases for the memory, and all are made by Alpha and Omega semiconductors. The GPU phases are managed by a Richtech RT8848C controller, while the memory is managed by the Richtech RT8843B controller. All phases for both the GPU and memory are using the AOZ5311NQI power stage modules and are rated for 55 amps of continuous current. The heatsink that keeps this circuitry under control is split with a copper base for the GPU, aluminium base for the memory, and a heat pipe for the phases, in kind of a hope to split the heat to different areas on the finned heatsink. Including the MOSFET heat pipe, there's a total of 8 6mm heat pipes, and is a solution that we have seen before on other cards. Also, to help with temperatures, the backplate, which is on the kind of slightly thicker side compared to other models, does have heat pads to help dissipate heat away. So a pretty hefty cooler for a 4070 Ti, and a unique way of kind of working in terms of the mixed plates that make contact with various parts of the card. But let's see how the card compares in terms of performance to other cards we've tested. Starting off with our testing with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the INNO3D card sees a small increase of just 1% over the Asus TUF card, but also puts the iCHILL card 1% lower than the Gigabyte 4070 Ti in the averages, with our 1% low sitting at a very slightly larger gap of 2.5% over the Asus card, and then tying with the Gigabyte card in performance. Though at just 1 FPS difference, this really is negligible. Next up is Cyberpunk, where Inno took the lead with both the highest average and 1% low of each of the tested cards, now sitting 4% higher than the closest competitor in the averages and 8% higher in the 1% lows. This sounds great, but in reality is only 2 to 3 frames more overall. In Death Stranding, the 1% lows were identical for every card, while the averages again saw Inno3D sitting ahead of the Gigabyte card, albeit by a very small margin of 2%, while the Asus TUF card came in with the exact same performance. Watch Dogs Legion rounds off our stock gameplay performance, where the iCHILL once again matches the performance of the Asus card with a very nice 69 FPS, while Gigabyte took the top spot with a 2% lead. So the stock performance of this card is pretty much what you'd expect. All of the 4070 Ti's stay right around the same performance milestone, with only a few percent differences between each card, kind of not really favouring any card in particular. Now, where the cards really start to stand out from each other is in the thermal performance and power usage. And to get these measurements, we ran F122 for an hour loop to get an idea of kind of where levels sit during a gaming session. And what we found was the GPU temperature sat around the 66 degree mark, with the hotspot reaching up to highs of 81 degrees, placing it above both other 4070 Ti cards we've previously looked at. The memory, however, sat much lower than the other 2 cards at just 60 degrees under sustained load. Then power usage was also on the slightly higher side, with a peak power draw of 289 watts, while the fan stayed at a fairly reasonable 1520 RPM, which wasn't particularly audible during our test. In terms of how this compares to the other 4070 Ti cards that we've had in our offices, it is the hottest, the most power hungry, and the loudest, but with only small margins between them, and going up against the likes of the Asus TUF Gaming and Gigabyte Gaming OC, it's not exactly a deal breaker and is very unlikely to be noticed during gameplay anyway. So with our card now tested at stock, it's time to look at how well we can overclock it and whether it's worth doing in the search for some free performance. After cranking up the temperature limit, we set to work and managed to increase the core clock by 150 MHz, bringing our core clock speed now up to 2460 MHz with a boost speed of 2820 MHz. The memory clock was also increased by 1200 MHz, now giving us a memory clock speed of 1463 MHz, or a little over 23 gigabit per second effective. Once we were happy with the levels of stability, we ran F122 again for another hour to get our thermal and power results, while also giving us the opportunity to test the stability of the overclock and make sure that we've got the card to a point where you could happily play for hours without artifacting or crashing. What we noticed is that there was very little difference in our temperatures, with the GPU only going up by a single degree after the overclock, whilst the GPU hotspot temperature didn't change at all and still stayed around the same 81 degrees. On top of this, the memory temperature ended up going down by 2 degrees, now at 58, but none of this is too surprising, as when we look at the fan usage, we can see that it's risen to 1631 RPM in an aim to keep the components cool while under the extra stress. In terms of power, while the limits couldn't be raised, the overclock does come at a cost to it, now using around 6% more power overall. This now means that the Inno card, when overclocked, takes the top spot above both the Asus and Gigabyte cards, and what's more interesting is that those two cards sit below the stock performance of the iCHILL X3 even when they are overclocked, in terms of temperature, and apart from the Asus card, in power too, though not by any significant margin. So with our newfound overclock, were we able to garner any more performance in game? So, like before, we booted up some games to see what kind of difference it gives us. So again, starting things off with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where we see a 6% uplift in performance over stock, which now places the card only 1% over the overclocked Asus TUF Gaming card, and in line with the performance from Gigabyte. The 1% lows also saw a small jump up by 4%, but Inno3D had the lowest 1% lows of the cards, sitting 2% below both of the other cards. Next up is Cyberpunk, and here we see a 4% boost in performance over stock in the averages, and a 2.5% improvement in the 1% lows. Compared to the other cards, the iCHILL still remains at the top of our stack, commanding the same 4% lead in performance that we saw at stock. Death Stranding sees a 2.5% increase in performance over stock in the averages, while at the same time the Asus TUF Gaming takes a stronger lead, now putting it at the top of the stack, a place where it shared identical performance at stock before. The 1% lows also saw just under a 5% increase in performance, though the Asus card managed a slightly stronger lead of just under 6%. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, the Inno3D card again takes the top spot by increasing its performance by 7% in the averages and a smaller, but still admirable 6% in the all-important lows. This now puts it around 1% faster than both the Asus and Gigabyte cards, which are priced a little bit cheaper. So coming into this, I had a rough idea as to what to expect. At the end of the day, it's a 4070 Ti, and between different models, there really isn't much in it when it comes to gameplay performance. But the Inno3D card did well, especially in comparison to the Asus TUF Gaming card, which we know is a tried and tested product. The big issue right now still comes down to price, because Inno3D don't set pricing for their cards other than listening to what MSRP is in place by Nvidia, and instead rely on the retailers and distribution channels to kind of set their own pricing to be competitive in a market which is still somewhat sideways. Right now, you can get the iCHILL X3 card for a little under £1,000, which is a bit on the expensive side, but I could only find it available at one retailer, which puts it in a weird situation because that makes the card kind of inflated price-wise, and I'd much rather see it closer to what an Asus TUF Gaming card is actually retailing for, which currently is under £900. But even then, for a 4070 Ti, it's a bit much, as I made clear in our launch day coverage. So what do you get for that extra money? Well, the card is a looker. I've been a fan of the iCHILL X3 range for quite some time, and while having a card that is basically the same size as its bigger brothers, the 4080 and 4090, might, I don't know, put some people off a little bit, especially given the size of the PCB, it shows that it definitely makes up for it in the cooling department, where it's able to compete with some bigger brands on the market. Same goes for the overclocking potential, which did mean that it came in the hottest and the most power hungry once overclocked, but only by a small margin, and for the most part in gaming, that did give it a slight edge over the competition. Again, right now, buying a GPU, even if something as new as the 4070 Ti, really comes down to what's available at the time you're looking to buy. And coupled with the fact that I could only find this card at one retailer at the time of producing this content, goes to show that even at a slightly inflated price, they are selling. Luckily, for the money you do get a very well built card, and one that shouldn't be dismissed in favour of other brands. Inno3D have definitely done enough to kind of throw them into the mix, and definitely feels, I don't know, better in terms of build quality than the likes of the Gaming OC from Gigabyte. Not that the Gaming OC is bad in any shape or form. This just, I don't know, feels better. Better built, I guess. Yeah, a bit more solid. So if you are looking to buy a 4070 Ti, then you have options. And the iCHILL X3 is, well, one that won't disappoint. That about wraps up this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and want to get a metric ton of goodies, then head on over to our Patreon, where you'll get access to behind the scenes content, exclusive live Q&A sessions, access to our bi-weekly game night, and all that good stuff. The link for that is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.